On the evening of May 11th, 2006, a 29-year-old hairdresser named Nisha Patel Nasri sat down for a rare break in between clients inside of her hair salon in the Wembley district of London. Nisha had opened up the salon when she was just 18 years old, and she'd been running it herself for the last 11 years. And in that time, she'd attracted around 2,000 regular customers, which was already very impressive. But it was particularly impressive because this was not like a big salon on a bustling city street. Instead, it was a tiny shop on a quiet residential road way out in the northwest suburbs of London. She actually ran the salon out of a single room in her brother's house, but through hard work and sheer talent, she had grown it into a thriving business. Now, generally speaking, Nisha was glad to be busy, because if she was busy, it meant she was making money. But sometimes, like right this second, stopping and kind of kicking back and relaxing for a second when she could felt very welcome. And so she plopped down into a salon chair, she grabbed the morning paper, and she started reading it. The front page story was about how the government had just released its report on the previous year's July 7th bombings, which were a series of terrorist attacks that had taken place on London's trains and buses during the morning rush hour. Now, it had been almost 10 months since these horrific attacks, but Londoners still did not feel safe. I mean, because of this attack, there was this growing fear of really all types of violent crime that could be visited upon them. It just felt like this shattered their worldview. And Nisha, more than most people, could really understand why people felt that way. In fact, she personally had experienced an attempted home invasion recently. Just 5 days ago, when Nisha had been at her house, located about a block away from the salon, she had been making dinner when she had begun to hear the front mail slot rattling. So on her front door, there was a slot that could open up from the outside where the mail person could slide mail into her house. Now, when Nisha heard this, she didn't immediately, panic. I mean, it's pretty normal for mail to be dropped off through her door, but, she was curious, so she walked to the front of the house and she looked out the window to see who it was. Was it the mail person? Was it a neighbor? Was it a friend? But when she looked out, it was none of those people. It were these 3 men wearing dark clothes who she didn't know who they were, and they were clearly trying to break into her house. But these men had picked the wrong house to rob, because in addition to being a hairdresser, Nisha was also a special constable, which was basically a part-time volunteer police officer. So instead of her, hiding or calling for help, she'd just gone out to confront the men herself. And they'd been so caught off guard by how confidently she strode out there and called them off that they'd literally just turned and ran away. Now, even though Nisha had really handled this quite well and basically scared these guys away, it left her feeling really unsettled. And so that, combined with the lasting trauma that Londoners felt because of the bombings of the year before, Nisha these days was feeling very much on edge. However, every time Nisha found herself sort of defaulting to that victim mindset, being fearful that something else terrible is going to happen to her, she would remind herself that, she was a special constable, and whatever problems were thrown her way, she would handle them like she always did. But even though for Nisha that was sort of a confidence booster, for other people in Nisha's family, they weren't so thrilled she was a special constable. In particular, her older brother, Caton, the one who actually owned the house where Nisha ran her salon, he had pleaded with her not to join the special constable program because he felt like the work was way too dangerous. There were constantly stories in the papers about attacks on police. And unlike full-time officers, special constables were not authorized to use weapons to defend themselves. But for Nisha, that had never been an issue. She felt very proud of what she was doing, especially now that everybody was so on edge after the July 7th bombings. Now was the time for people to continue to step up and keep London safe, and so she felt like that's what she was doing. And so as Nisha finished reading the front page of the paper, she heard a bell jingle on the front door of the salon. So she tucked the newspaper away, hopped up, and went to go greet her next client. Later that night, around 10 p.m., Nisha closed up shop and swept the salon floor. And then a few minutes later, she heard the front door jingle again, and she looked up and saw her husband, whose name was Fatal Harbinger, walking in with a paper bag of takeout food. Nisha instinctively shouted up the stairs for her brother, Caton, who had come home from work earlier that evening and had been hanging out in his part of the house since then. And a moment later, he came down the stairs to join the couple for some food. Fadi spread out the plastic containers of Indian food on the coffee table in the waiting area, and Caton began eating, while Fadi went ahead and sat down in Nisha's salon chair to get his haircut. And Nisha was even more careful than usual with his haircut. because she and her husband were going to their brother's wedding in a couple of days, and Nisha and Fadi knew they'd be in all the wedding pictures, and so they wanted to look their best. While she cut Fadi's hair, she helped her brother talk through preparations for the wedding. Their mother and father had both passed away years ago, so when it came to big family events like this, the two siblings were kind of on their own. Caton reminisced about how he'd given Nisha away at her own wedding, which was exactly 3 years ago yesterday, since their own father couldn't. Nisha smiled as she continued cutting Fadi's hair. Thinking about their wedding anniversary reminded her how grateful she was for her husband and the life they'd built together since. A few months after they had gotten married, Nisha had loaned Fadi some money to open up a limousine rental company, and his business had really taken off. And Nisha was proud to see her husband working these long hours and making great money. It felt like they really were a team, two ambitious, successful business owners working together to build a better future. Once Fadi's haircut was done, Nisha called Caton over and she gave him a pre-wedding trim as well. And as she finished up, Caton asked her if maybe she wanted to spend the night here at his house. He was still rattled by that attempted break-in at Nisha's house a couple of days earlier, and he really didn't feel like she was safe in her own home. But Nisha said, no, we're fine. So around 11 p.m., Nisha and her husband Fadi walked back to their house, which was, again, right around the corner. Their house was a cream-colored, two-story home with red shingles on the roof. And along with Fadi's car in the driveway, there was a stretch limo and a Humvee parked on the curb that Fadi used for work, and which both very much stood out in their middle-class neighborhood. Nisha unlocked the door and then tossed her phone and keys on the sofa and then went upstairs to get ready for bed. But while she was in the bathroom washing her face, Fadi popped his head in and told her he was heading out to go meet with his friend to go play snooker, which is a way of saying pool, but in the UK. Now, Nisha was not offended that he wanted to go out and see his friend, like that was fine. But in reality, she and her husband had been talking about wanting to start a family. And for the most part, they both agreed that now was the time to, try to have kids. And so when she was thinking about tonight, she was thinking, maybe we could, try to have a baby tonight. But it just seemed like not only tonight, but just generally speaking, every time there was like a window to, try to have a kid, Fadi was either too tired or he was going out with friends, or it just seemed like he would say he was interested, but then when it was time to actually do the thing, he was nowhere to be found. And so it seemed like that was happening again tonight. But it was late, and Nisha didn't feel like arguing with her husband, so she dried her face and just told Fadi to have fun with his friend. A few minutes later, as Nisha brushed her teeth, she heard the sound of her husband's car pulling out of the driveway. A little bit later, she went downstairs and turned off the lights and locked the doors, and then went back upstairs and crawled into bed alone. But then, about 30 minutes later, right as Nisha is about to fall asleep, she hears these footsteps in her house, and she didn't hear the sound of her husband return home. She just hears these footsteps downstairs. And so she sits up and she's hearing these sounds, and she thinks to herself, it could be my husband. Or, because just less than a week ago, somebody tried to break into her house, she's thinking, are they back? Has someone broken into my house? And so not sure who was down there, she got out of bed quietly, grabbed a flashlight, tiptoed out of her room, and then began heading downstairs to see who was in her house. A few minutes later, one of Nisha's neighbors was woken up by blood-curdling screams in the street outside his house. He jumped out of bed, went to the window, pulled back the curtain, and when he looked out, he saw Nisha limping down the street in her nightgown with a flashlight in her hand. And so the neighbor instinctively called for an ambulance and then rushed outside to help Nisha. And when he caught up with Nisha, she was hobbling back up her own driveway, and he asked her if she was okay, and she just choked out that she'd been stabbed. But before she could say who stabbed her, she collapsed onto the pavement, clutching this bloody spot on her thigh. At this exact moment, the neighbor looked up from Nisha, and he saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away down the street. By this point also, more people were trickling out onto the road, and another woman ran over to Nisha and put a towel on her leg and began pressing on the wound. And then as soon as the first neighbor who had gone outside and seen Nisha, as soon as he heard the ambulance coming down the road, he stood up and he bolted down the road to go find Nisha's brother and tell him what had happened and what he had seen. Over this past winter break, when myself, my wife, and my 3 kids were home, I was sent this package of my mochi, which is like ice cream, these little bites of premium ice cream wrapped in this sweet, chewy dough. And I was told, like, hey, try this out, see if you like it, and see if you want to advertise this product. And I'm like, all right, I obviously tried the product, and I am hooked on my mochi. Like, seriously, I was blown away by how good these things are. I was sent strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. And let me tell you, cookies and cream is out of this world. It's so refreshing. That's the way my wife and I refer to my mochi, as being like very refreshing. And so we plow through all this mochi we got sent, and literally we went out before this big snowstorm. We went out to the grocery store before it shut down because of the storm, just to buy all the mochi we could. Crushed it. It's so good. It's only 70 calories. It's gluten-free. It's so good, you gotta try it. My mochi, it's the best. Each purple box comes with 6 perfectly portioned mochi snacks, available in mouth-watering flavors like strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. Cookies and cream, really quite good. Feel joyfully chill with every bite of My Mochi ice cream. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. It's really, really good. The next morning, after Detective Scola was finally done processing the scene, he walked into the Wembley police station, and it was unusually quiet. The other officers looked very somber. A little bit confused, Scola asked one of his colleagues what was going on here, and she would tell him that the victim, Nisha from last night's murder, was one of their own. She was a special constable, and plenty of officers in the Wembley station had worked with her. And so Scola now understood, what a gut punch this really was. But also, this information was pretty interesting to Scola, because at first, he thought Nisha was killed in like a random robbery gone wrong, but now Scola wondered if this murder was not random at all. Maybe Nisha was being targeted because she was a police officer. Maybe there was a criminal who she had put behind bars or prosecuted in some way that was out to get her. And when Scola began doing some digging on Nisha and some of her police work, he learned that Nisha had actually had somebody try to break into her house a few days earlier. There were these 3 men that she had basically scared off when they had tried to break into her house. And so now Scola's thinking, that can't be a coincidence. And so right away, a team of officers got to work trying to figure out the identities of those 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house the first time. And so while the officers did that, Scola headed back to the crime scene to go see if he could find that knife that was missing from the kitchen. He figured at this point that had to be the murder weapon, and if it was, the killer's fingerprints or DNA could be on the knife. When Scola pulled up on Sudbury Avenue a little bit later, he saw swarms of reporters and TV cameras crowding around the house, where the crime scene tape was still up, keeping them back. And as Scola approached the house, a reporter noticed him and ran towards him with a microphone and began asking him questions. Namely, did the police have any idea why a special constable had been murdered at her own home? But Scola brushed the reporter off. He was not about to talk about this case yet. He really did not have any information to give up anyways. And he ducked under the police tape. Once inside the cordoned off area, Scola saw there were dozens of officers already scouring the area looking for this missing knife, dumping out trash cans and digging through the bushes. Scola caught one of the investigators' eyes and she kind of shrugged, which Scola took to mean that they hadn't found it yet. Scola also watched as 2 other officers hauled this high-powered vacuum out of a truck and over to a storm drain on the curb. And then they turned on this vacuum and began sucking up everything out of the drain, presumably to look for this knife. Scola walked over to them right as they began sifting through what they had sucked up. The vacuum had pulled up a whole bunch of stuff between leaves and trash and food wrappers, but ultimately there was no knife. Scola figured the killer must have dumped this knife somewhere near the crime scene, because they couldn't have gotten far before they realized they needed to get rid of it. And so Scola felt confident that this knife was going to turn up eventually. They just had to keep on looking. In the meantime, Scola went back inside the house, where he found a pair of investigators sitting in the living room with Nisha's husband, Fadi. And Fadi had his phone out, and he was playing a recording of this woman shouting violent threats. One of the officers who saw Scola pulled him aside and caught him up to speed. They said that Fadi had a solid alibi for the time of Nisha's murder. He was with a friend playing snooker a few miles away, and that friend had already confirmed it. And the officer also told Scola that Fadi had come forward and said that he already had a pretty good idea of who might have killed his wife. And so Scola sat down on the couch next to Fadi, and Fadi at that point started his story from the beginning. He said that 2 months ago, he'd gotten into a feud with a rival limo business owner in Scotland. He said that he had sold a Humvee to this other company under the condition that after the sale, Fadi could borrow it back for one last job. But the other company's owner had gone back on the deal and refused to let him borrow the car after the transaction. So in a moment of what he was calling poor judgment, Fadi had traveled to Scotland, rented the Humvee under a fake name, and driven it all the way back to London. But then Fadi said, while he was driving back to London, clearly the other owner figured out what Fadi was up to, because they gave Fadi a call, and Fadi recorded the voicemail they left. And so Fadi played the recording of this other business owner for Scola. And Scola, he heard this woman screaming over and over again that she was going to kill Fadi and his wife if he didn't bring her Humvee back. And as Scola listened, he thought this woman did not sound like she was joking. This seemed like a real threat. Now, Fadi said he did return the Humvee. He gave it back to the business owner, and so she no longer had a reason to kill him and his wife. Still though, Fadi felt strongly that, this woman really had it out for them, and so he wanted the police to look into her. And for Scola, they really didn't have that many leads to think of, and so he figured he would check it out first. So he took Fadi's phone to download that audio recording and also all the call logs, and then he promised he would send a team to Scotland to look into this right away. One afternoon, about a month later, Detective Scola sat in his office alone, going over the case files again and again. He was stressed because the media had been covering Nisha's murder since day one, and there was a lot of public pressure to solve this case. But the police had been investigating it really aggressively for a month, but realistically had almost nothing to show for it. Ever since Scola's last conversation with Fadi, the investigation had been moving very slowly. Some detectives had gone to Scotland to look into this rival business owner angle who had, supposedly threatened Fadi and his wife, but they hadn't found anything notable. So that lead was looking like a bust. Also, the homicide team had not been able to identify those 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house 5 days before she was killed. Scola and his team had interviewed Nisha's family, her friends, her neighbors, but so far they had not been able to identify any likely suspects, again outside of that business owner in Scotland. It just didn't seem like there was anyone who would have wanted to hurt Nisha. She was liked and respected by basically everyone they spoke to. However, there had been one pretty significant development in the case over the past month, and it was that police had finally found a knife that looked similar to the one missing from Nisha's kitchen. It was found in a storm drain about a block away from her house. However, Scola was still waiting for the crime lab to actually determine whether it was the murder weapon or not. But just then, Scola got a phone call, and it was someone from the crime lab. And they told him that after analyzing this knife, they had found traces of Nisha's blood on the blade. So this definitely was the murder weapon. For the first time in weeks, Scola felt really optimistic. He finally had a real piece of hard evidence, a fresh clue here to really lead this investigation. And now he needed all hands on deck. So he hung up the phone and then gathered his team for a meeting. And then once they were all together, he told the other detectives that they had found the murder weapon. But they had to keep their discovery a secret. If the killer found out police had this knife, they might panic and flee. And so to avoid jeopardizing the investigation, Scola wanted to keep the discovery out of the press. After everybody was aligned on that, the next step in the investigation was that Scola was going to send officers out to collect video from all the security cameras near where the knife had been found. London is one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the entire world, with hundreds of thousands of CCTV cameras everywhere. So Scola figured one of those cameras must have captured the person who dropped that knife into the drain. The homicide squad would spend the rest of the week combing through countless hours of CCTV footage from the area, hoping to find the moment when the knife got dropped in the storm drain. But it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. However, after about a week of this, another detective eagerly called Scola over to his computer. He said he had finally found something that could be useful. And so Scola walked over, and the detective said that the footage he was looking at, which was paused at the moment, was of a CCTV camera taken from a shop that was on the same road as the storm drain. and so Scola bent down and stared at the screen as the detective hit play on the video. Now, the storm drain itself was just barely out of frame, but the camera clearly captured the glow of headlights as a car pulled up near the storm drain. The car stopped there for about 7 seconds, and even though you cannot see anybody getting out and disposing of a knife into the drain, the car was stopped long enough that somebody could have done that before the car took off again. But critically, when this car took off again, it passed through this camera's frame very clearly. And as the car drove past the storefront, the detective paused the camera. As soon as he did, Scola leaned in closer to get a better look at this car. Now, the video was dark and grainy, so right away it was impossible to read the license plate on the car. But despite the graininess, there definitely were a few identifying details Scola could make out. The car was clearly a gray Audi, and there was an antenna in the center of the roof, and also one of the lights above the license plate was not working. Now, Scola knew there were literally tens of thousands of Audis in London, and so they knew the only way they'd track this one down is by sending officers out into the street to literally look for it. But really what they're looking for is Audis that have that antenna on the roof and a light that doesn't work in front. Now, of course, this was going to be extremely time-consuming, but Scola felt like they didn't have a better lead here, and so they began this process. And for the next few weeks, that's all they were doing, just out on the streets canvassing for this Audi, and they didn't find it. And so as this investigation was feeling like it was about to hit another dead end, Scola felt like he just couldn't let that happen. There was too much pressure on him to get this done. But then suddenly, he thought about something that he'd totally put out of his mind: Fadi's phone. They'd actually taken the phone from Fadi 2 months ago to download that voicemail and also download the call log, but they actually hadn't given it back to Fadi yet. They were just holding the phone in evidence right now. Now, Scola felt like that audio message on the phone really had not amounted to anything and likely wouldn't. But Scola figured, why don't we look in that phone to see what else is on there? Maybe there were fresh clues about who might have wanted to hurt Nisha. So he assigned one of his forensic techs to download everything from Fadi's phone onto a drive. And then once they had done that, Scola took this drive and he plugged it into his computer and began sorting through all this data. He saw a photo that caught his eye. The photo was of a woman's thigh, and she was clearly lying in a bed in what looked like a hotel room. And even with the bright flash and poor camera quality, Scola could tell that the woman's skin was pale white, and so it was definitely not Nisha's leg. After finding this photo on Fadi's phone, Scola immediately drove to Nisha and Fadi's house. And when Fadi opened the door, Scola stepped inside and showed him the photo and asked him point blank if he was having an affair. Fadi right away said no, and he insisted he would never do that to Nisha, and the woman in the picture was literally just a friend. Now, Scola immediately felt like Fadi was lying. He did not believe him for a second. But there was no way to, force Fadi to tell the truth. And so ultimately, all Scola could do was just leave, get back in his car, go back to the station. And on the drive there, he wondered to himself if he had sort of just blown that opportunity. Should he have waited for more solid evidence before confronting Fadi? But he was also thinking that, there's so much pressure on him to solve this case, that he just had to make moves like this, take some chances, and so it is what it is. When Scola got to the precinct, he parked his car and he went in his office to think. And almost as soon as he sat down, there was a knock at the door. It was a man named Sid Shenoy, who was the family liaison officer who'd been working with Nisha's family. His job was to support the grieving family and communicate with them throughout the investigation. And so as a result of this role he was playing, Sid had created a level of trust with the family that really none of the other detectives had with the family. And Shenoy, when he walked in the room, told Scola that he'd just gotten a really interesting call from Fadi. He said Fadi had confessed to something that he'd basically been too afraid to tell Scola in person when he had just been visiting him, a couple minutes ago. And so Shenoy told Scola that you really ought to call Fadi and let him tell you what he just told me. And so right away, that's what Scola did. He called Fadi. And Fadi, when he picked up, he sounded very nervous and anxious and ashamed as he broke down and admitted that actually, yes, he was having an affair. He had lied. He said the leg in the photo belonged to a woman named Laura Mocking, and she was a Lithuanian sex worker who he'd been seeing for 3 months before his wife's death. Fadi said the reason he had lied to Scola is because he didn't want Nisha's family to find out he'd been cheating on her. But Scola knew there was also another obvious reason to lie here, because an affair would clearly give Fadi a motive to kill his wife. Fadi had been crossed off the suspect list at this point just based on his alibi. But this affair now made him look very suspicious. However, Scola just felt like it just didn't make sense that Fadi would be the killer. Number one, he did have a strong alibi. And also two, apart from hiding this affair, which you could justify, you could say that obviously he didn't want ripple effect damage on the family or something, he'd been very cooperative with the investigation. I mean, he'd given them his phone, which had this damning photo on it. I mean, he'd sort of been very forthright. And so a new theory began to take hold in Scola's mind. If Fadi wasn't the killer, maybe it was possible that his mistress, Laura, was, or at least was directly involved in some way. I mean, she would have all the reason in the world to want to get rid of Nisha. So on September 1st, almost 4 months after Nisha was murdered, her husband's mistress, Laura Mawkeen, was brought into the station on suspicion of murder. In the interrogation room, detectives confronted her with all the evidence they had gathered that showed her relationship with Fadi was not just a casual affair. The two of them had met at a brothel where Laura was working as a sex worker, but eventually she stopped charging him to see her, which likely meant she must have developed real feelings for him. And so the detectives suggested that, if Nisha was gone for good, Laura would have Fadi all to herself. Laura insisted she did not know anything about the murder, and then she gave them a solid alibi. But that didn't mean much, because eyewitnesses thought they saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away after Nisha was stabbed. So the working theory was if Laura was involved in this murder, it was pretty likely that she had hired somebody else to do the dirty work. However, the detectives did not have real evidence, and so despite their suspicions, they had to release her. And then once again, they were back at square one. However, not long after Laura was allowed to go home, Scola was walking through the precinct when the family liaison officer, Sid Shenoy, came running up behind him. Shenoy told him that he just had a very interesting conversation with Nisha's brother, Caton. Caton had told him that after finding out about Fadi's affair, he had been furious. The whole family was so upset about it. And Caton said that now that he really had this horrible opinion of Fadi, he felt comfortable sharing something about Fadi that he had been keeping to himself. Caton told Shenoy that he thought Fadi might not be the professional businessman he pretended to be. Instead, Caton said that Fadi might actually be involved with something criminal. According to Caton, Fadi had said there were a lot of sketchy people in his contacts, and he was worried about what the police might find on his phone. But Caton said that Fadi had not been specific about what he meant when he said sketchy people. He didn't know what he was saying or why he was involved with them. And so after hearing this, Scola told his team to go through Fadi's phone records and run the name of every person who appeared in his call log. And apart from all the calls back and forth to Laura, the mistress, there was one other name that jumped out, a convicted drug dealer named Roger Leslie. And when Scola saw this, he realized that he might have been approaching this investigation all wrong. He'd really struggled to find suspects because there was no one who would have wanted to hurt Nisha who didn't have an alibi. But now he realized that maybe that was the case because Nisha was not actually the killer's target. Maybe the target was Fadi. If Fadi was involved in the drug trade, then anyone could have come after him for any number of reasons. It could have been a drug deal gone wrong, or retribution for a debt he didn't pay, or even maybe a hit by a rival gang. He didn't know, but there was way more possibilities here. And the more Scola dug into Fadi, the more suspicious evidence he found. He learned that before Fadi and Nisha got married, Fadi had run an escort agency. He'd closed it down and started a more legitimate business 3 years ago, but Scola knew there could be any number of former employees or customers wives who might still have a problem with Fadi. And then there was that threatening voicemail from the rival limo company. I mean, that whole story made it seem entirely possible that Fadi could easily get wrapped up in very serious business disputes, which meant there could be more disgruntled rivals out there. Basically, it seemed entirely possible that there were loads of people out there who might have had it out for Fadi, not Nisha. And so that became the new direction of this investigation. And so the first person Scola looked into with this new direction was Roger Leslie, the drug dealer who had made a few calls to Fadi. However, there was one issue that kept Roger from becoming a primary suspect. He didn't own a gray Audi. So if he was involved in the murder, he probably didn't work alone. And so the police set up a trace on Roger Leslie's phone, hoping that his call logs would lead them to an associate who did own a gray Audi. And eventually, they sure did. And that person who owned the gray Audi was the missing piece that made the whole puzzle come together. Based on those call logs and all the other evidence found during this investigation, the following is what police believe happened to Nisha Patel Nasri on May 11, 2006. Around 11:50 p.m., just as Nisha was falling asleep, the killer pulled up to her house in the passenger seat of a gray Audi. The driver waited in the car while the killer got out and crept around to the back of the house. And as he walked to the back of the house, he kept looking in the windows to confirm all the lights were out. And they were. And then when he got to the back door, he pulled out a key he'd managed to get his hands on to open it up. And then once the door was open, he stepped inside. The killer slowly moved through the kitchen and then stopped because he heard the floorboards upstairs creaking. And so he held his breath as he realized that somebody upstairs was making their way downstairs. They were caught. The killer didn't know what to do. They hadn't prepared for this at all. He thought everybody in the house would be asleep. So he panicked and he reached over and pulled a knife out of that butcher's block in the kitchen and then ducked behind a wall to hide. He heard the footsteps getting closer and closer, and he's trying his best to hide. And then he saw a beam of a flashlight make its way into the kitchen, and then it comes across and lands squarely right on them. And the person holding that flashlight was Fadi's wife, Nisha. When Nisha saw the killer, she screamed and ran for the front door. But the killer knew he could not let her get away because now she'd gotten a clear look at his face and he was caught. So he chased her outside, out into the driveway, clutching that kitchen knife in his hand, and about halfway down the driveway, he tackled her and then sunk the knife deep into her thigh. Nisha actually managed to fight him off despite this gaping wound in her leg, and she scrambled up and began running down the street screaming for help. And at this point, the killer saw lights coming on in the neighbors' houses, and his heart was pounding, and he knew that Nisha was no longer his biggest problem. He had to get out of here immediately before anybody on the block saw his face too. So he just sprinted back to the Audi, where the driver was still waiting for him, and he told the driver to go, just take off, drive out of here. And so the driver, they did just that, but they were panicked and confused, and as they're going around the corner, they're asking the killer, like, what just happened? I mean, as far as the driver knew, they were only here to pick up some ecstasy for a drug deal. They did not expect anybody to get stabbed. But the killer just snapped at the driver to stop talking about it because he hadn't expected the night to go this way either. It was a total mess. And so at this point, the killer looked down at the bloody knife that was still in his hand, and he realized he had to get rid of it. And so he told the driver to just pull over. And so the driver did. They pulled over to the curb on this commercial street just a block away from Nisha's house, and the killer quickly opened up the door and threw the knife into a nearby storm drain. Then he slammed the door shut again, and as the Audi careened down the road, the killer took the driver's cell phone out of the cup holder and called the man who'd hired him to tell him everything that had just gone horribly wrong. The person he called was the drug dealer, Roger Leslie. However, when Roger got off that phone call with the killer, Roger immediately called the person who'd hired him. Roger had actually been hired to pull off a hit, but he didn't want to get his own hands dirty, so he'd outsourced the job. But now, after having spoken to the killer about this botched hit where basically they stabbed her and they had no idea if she actually was going to die or not, in fact, the last thing they saw was her running down the road screaming for help, now Roger knew he would have to explain himself to the actual mastermind of the murder plot, the person who'd given him the key to get inside. And that person was indeed Fadi Nasri, Nisha's husband. It turned out that Fadi was involved with a bunch of criminals, but they weren't after him. They were his friends. Because even though Fadi pretended to be this successful, legitimate businessman, he really was not. He was deep in debt, and he'd paid Roger Leslie to kill Nisha for the life insurance money. That way he could pay his debts and then also run off with his new mistress, Laura. And so while Nisha had been wanting to start a family and was starting to sense that maybe Fadi was not fully committed to that idea, well, her instincts were good because it turned out Fadi did not want to start a family with her. He wanted to kill her and move on. According to prosecutors, that earlier break-in at Nisha and Fadi's house a few days before she was killed was very likely either a reconnaissance mission or a failed first attempt to kill Nisha. In the end, 4 people were arrested and charged with Nisha's murder. They were Fadi Nasri, Roger Leslie, the hitman who actually stabbed Nisha, his name was Jason Jones, and the driver of the car, a man named Tony Emanuel. Now, the driver was acquitted, but the other 3 men were all convicted and sentenced to life in prison. At about 8:20 in the morning on June 29, 2025, an 83-year-old woman named June Baxter shuffled her way down the hallway of her small home in Attleborough, which is a quiet town in eastern England. As she walked, she had to keep one hand on the wall to keep her balance. She was pretty frail these days and also just had a lot of medical problems. But she also really valued her independence, and so she was determined to keep living alone, even if it was kind of risky. So June used to live with her husband and their dog. But about 7 years earlier, her husband had gotten really sick, and so because of that, they'd had to give their dog to their granddaughter because they just couldn't take care of it anymore and also care for him. And then unfortunately, June's husband did pass away, and so she was left all alone. But even though she was, all alone in terms of living in the house by herself, she wasn't completely isolated. Her granddaughter, who she had given the dog to, lived close by and visited a whole bunch, and almost always brought along June's old dog, which June loved. Now, in addition to just being good company, June's granddaughter also regularly made herself available to help June with all sorts of basic things, like, picking up her prescriptions and going grocery shopping for her and, driving her to and from doctor's appointments. Like, she was really available to her. But despite June knowing that, knowing she could always call on her, she tried hard not to call on her granddaughter, because again, she just really liked being independent. So on this particular day, she, continued slowly walking down the hallway, guiding herself by holding onto the wall, and then she turned the corner to go to the bathroom. And when she stepped inside, she slipped on the tile. And as she was falling to the ground, her leg scraped the corner of the bathroom counter. Immediately, June's leg started bleeding and June's yelling out in pain, but she lives alone, nobody can hear her. And so June quickly went from, just reacting to the pain and the blood. June was scared. I mean, this is the exact scenario that she was so worried about, getting hurt when she was all alone, because she didn't really have a plan. It was like, I'm gonna live alone, so help me. But fortunately for June, she had installed throughout her house all these emergency call bells that would allow her to basically, hit the bell, and they were programmed to contact both her granddaughter and also the local emergency services. And in the bathroom, there was one of these bells. And so once she kind of composed herself a little bit, grabbed the string for this bell, and she pulled it. About 10 minutes later, June was still in the bathroom on the ground, holding onto her leg wound, when she heard the front door of her house swing open. And immediately she heard the sound of her granddaughter calling out for her. And June, as best as she could, even though her voice was a little bit weak, she called out and said where she was. A moment later, June's granddaughter, along with June's old dog she'd brought along, came bombing around the corner, and they looked into the bathroom and they saw, June and her horrible leg wound, and clearly the granddaughter is really worried right away. I mean, this was a very bad cut. But, for June, she's looking at her granddaughter and she's just flooded with relief because she knows no matter how bad this is, her granddaughter is here, everything's fine, and also her dog was here, which made everything better already. And so while June's granddaughter began rummaging through the bathroom to look for some bandages, June just kind of relaxed and just began petting her dog, who was clearly very worried about June. This is her dog previously. They had a very strong bond. And so she just petting her dog, and then, June's granddaughter did find some bandages and she wrapped up June's leg. And then by the time the paramedics got there, June actually was feeling basically okay. I mean, her leg definitely hurt, but she was very calm at this point. A couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, and by this point, June was actually feeling basically back to normal. I mean, her leg definitely still hurt, but again, her granddaughter had put that dressing on it and basically stopped the bleeding, and also June has her dog that she's petting, like her comfort animal. And so she was very calm. Paramedics come in and they assess her and they take off the dressing to check the wound. And after they cleaned it, they said, look, this is a pretty minor cut. You don't even need stitches. I think you're okay, just be careful and maybe have your granddaughter stay here for a little bit just to make sure you don't fall again, but you're okay, like we're gonna go. And so June, she thanked the paramedics as they walked out the door, and then she and her granddaughter and the dog just sort of sat there feeling grateful that this fall wasn't more serious. However, the next morning when June woke up, she knew something was wrong because, all she's doing is laying in bed, but her heart is racing, she's sweating, she's lightheaded, like clearly something is off here. Now, the day before, after the paramedics left, her granddaughter did stick around for a little bit, but really, June was okay, and so June was alone. And that night, she had some soreness around the cut, but it really wasn't that serious. She really felt like dodged a bullet there. But now, 12 hours later, something's going on here. Now, June had no way of knowing if her current symptoms were indeed connected to her, minor cut on her leg. But her concern that maybe this was serious and could potentially spiral really quickly made her not pull on one of those emergency bells, but instead she just picked up the phone and called an ambulance to take her to the hospital. When she got to the hospital, doctors immediately began running all these tests on her. And very quickly, they determined that she did have a very severe bacterial infection, which she must have gotten after cutting her leg. And unfortunately, that infection had already spread into her blood, which would explain why she was feeling sweaty and lightheaded and why her heart was racing. Now, the medical staff definitely had some questions, like how in the world could this have developed so quickly, especially after the paramedics the day before had, at least according to them, properly cleaned this wound before they left. But, their issue now was not how did this happen, but instead just stabilize June, treat her. And so right away, they began treating June with general antibiotics to try to fight off this infection. But it just wasn't working. And June was 83 and already in relatively poor health, and her condition was clearly deteriorating rapidly. So the doctors began running more tests to try to determine exactly what type of bacteria was causing this infection. Because if they knew that, they might be able to give her more targeted treatment than just general antibiotics, which clearly were not working. And they did eventually identify this bacteria. But by the time they did, June had unfortunately already developed sepsis, which is a life-threatening condition that occurs when a person's body tries so hard to fight off an infection that it basically ends up damaging their vital organs in the process. Medical staff did everything they could, but it wasn't enough. And so eventually, 1 week after going to the hospital, June passed away. It would turn out the deadly bacteria that found its way into June's open wound was introduced to her by her granddaughter, completely by accident. The bacteria is called Pastorella multicida, and it's found in a very specific place, inside the mouths of domestic dogs. While June laid on the bathroom floor waiting for her granddaughter to find bandages to wrap up her leg, June's old beloved dog, who her granddaughter had brought over, was trying to comfort June, and June was allowing the dog to do that. But what the dog was actually doing to comfort June, was licking her open wound. And so that led to the bacteria going in, and it would kill June 1 week later. On the afternoon of March 4th, 2000, a 40-year-old woman named Ines Ramirez stood in the kitchen of her tiny one-room home, which was deep in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico. Ines had a whole chicken on the counter right in front of her that she had just killed and plucked, and now she was using a 6-inch-long knife to butcher it for their dinner. And as she did this, every once in a while, she would look out the window to check on her 7 kids who were playing together out in the yard. So Ines and her large family lived in a very isolated rural community of about maybe 500 people. They didn't have running water or electricity or a phone, and they lived miles away from their closest neighbors. They mainly lived off of corn and vegetables that they grew themselves, chickens they raised, and then wild animals that Ines's husband would catch. Her husband was actually gone that day because he was out in the mountains hunting for deer. And so as Ines is just kind of going about her fairly typical evening routine here, making dinner, she suddenly felt this really intense, very painful cramping sensation that was kind of ripping through her abdomen.
And it hurt so bad that Enos stopped what she was doing and kind of doubled over and grabbed the counter and just tried to steady her breathing. I mean, this was really shocking. And for about a minute, Enos just stood there, holding onto the counter, just waiting for this pain to pass, and eventually it did. And once it eased up, it was like, okay, she was back to normal and she could stand up again. But this was sort of alarming. But at the same time, Enos was used to dealing with basically all medical crises on her own. They lived in this isolated part of the world, and the nearest medical clinic was 50 miles away, and they didn't have a car. So, like anything that happened, they basically had to deal with it themselves, and that was routine. And so for Enos, despite how incredibly painful this was, she just told herself, like, now that it had passed, the pain was gone, she said, you know what? It's probably fine. Like, I'm good. And so pretty quickly, she just kind of forgot about it and went back to butchering the chicken. But several hours later, this is after midnight now, the pain came right back. And at this point, Enos, she's in this one common room in her house where all her kids are fast asleep. It's past midnight now, and she's sitting on this bench and she's gripping her abdomen, rocking back and forth as this pain just rockets back and forth across her abdomen constantly. There's no relief, nothing. And she's trying so hard not to make a sound because she doesn't want to wake her kids up, nor does she want to scare her kids. Her husband is still off in the mountains hunting for deer, so she is alone. She just has this little flickering candle nearby. That's the only light she's got, and she's just isolated, dealing with this excruciating pain. And so at this point, Enos really felt like this could be a real problem. This might not be something she could just brush off and let pass on its own. This was real. This was an actual emergency. But what can she even do? There's nowhere to go. She can't do anything. She is just completely trapped here with this excruciating pain that's making it hard to even have coherent thought. It's so bad. But the one thought that kept going through her mind was she had to do something, or whatever this was. It felt like it was going to kill her. And so Enos felt like she really only had one option here, and it was a horrible, horrible option. But she knew she had to do it. And so she got up and she's hunched over in pain, and as quietly as she could, she walked over to a cabinet and she opened it up and she grabbed a small bottle of alcohol and she took a few sips to kind of numb the pain a little bit. And then after she had done that, she turned around and, still with this blinding pain, she hobbled into the kitchen and she grabbed that 6-inch knife she had used earlier to butcher the chicken. And then she walked right back over to the bench near that candle that she'd been sitting on earlier. And once she was there, she reached down and she pulled up her shirt, exposing her abdomen, where this pain was coming from. And then she took the knife and she plunged it into her abdomen. And immediately she let out this blood-curdling scream. She couldn't help it. And she was sort of vaguely aware of all her kids waking up and sort of making their way over to her, but she was so focused on what she was doing, and she began slowly dragging this blade down her abdomen all the way to her belly button. And then she pulled out the knife and she can barely think. It's so painful. Her kids are crying. And then she plunged the knife back into her abdomen and raked it down the other side, creating this massive gash in her stomach. And then she kind of dropped the knife and she's screaming. She can't even help it, and her kids are all crying. And she takes her hand and she reaches into her stomach and she's fishing around. Every little move is like lightning striking her body. But she eventually finds what she's looking for and she pulls it out of her stomach. And what she's looking at is her 8th child, a baby boy. And she had enough wherewithal to take that knife and cut the umbilical cord and place the baby down before she passed out. After Enos lost consciousness, one of her kids left the house and just started running to go find the nearest person to get some help. And miraculously, after finding some people, when those first responders got to the home where Enos was, hours later, they found her and her newborn son alive. And they were taken to the closest hospital for emergency treatment, and they would both make full recoveries. Today, Enos Ramirez is the only woman ever who has performed a successful C-section on herself. In the early morning hours of December 3rd, 1921, A 62-year-old woman named Augusta Mrballen lay awake in her bedroom inside of her daughter's house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Augusta had lived with her daughter now for about a year. She had moved in after her husband had passed away. She just really hated being alone, and at night in particular, it was difficult to sleep sometimes. Just the weight of the loneliness was very intense. And also, Augusta was known to have really visceral bad dreams, and so that, combined with loneliness, made living alone really awful. So here she was, living with her daughter. But on this particular night, Augusta, she was wide awake in bed because she had had one of these awful nightmares, but she knew she could not tell her daughter about it. Now, normally one of the ways that Augusta would cope with these terrible nightmares, even when she was living alone, is she would get in touch with her daughter and they would talk about it. They would try to figure out if there was meaning in this awfulness of these nightmares. And sometimes they felt like they did find deeper meaning, and it sort of was cathartic for Augusta. But on this night, the dream she had just had, this nightmare, this visceral, awful nightmare, she knew, based on what she believed it meant, she absolutely could not tell her daughter anything about it. She had to hide it at all costs. In the dream Augusta had just had, she kind of came to and she was in her daughter's basement. So in the basement of the house she was in right now. And in front of her on the ground were these two perfectly circular, very, very deep holes, just that went straight into the ground. And so Augusta, she found herself walking towards the edge and looking over. And she saw it was like this unbelievable abyss in each hole. It's like it went on into infinity. But despite this innate fear she had for these holes, she sat down on the edge of one of these holes and basically dangled her feet over this, cataclysmic abyss below her. And as she's sitting there like a child dangling her feet, these two men in dark clothes, they wander over out of the shadows and they walk behind Augusta. They don't interact with her, and they go to the other hole, the hole that is next to Augusta. And she looks at these men and they're not looking at her. They're doing something. They're clearly in the middle of some sort of act. And they pull this huge carpet seemingly out of nowhere, and the two men stretch it out over this other hole next to Augusta, and they lay it over the hole. And as soon as Augusta saw that, she suddenly understood what was happening here, and she was horrified. So she woke up. And now here she was, knowing that based on what she just saw in her mind's eye in this horrible nightmare, that she could never share it with anyone, that she would live with the secret. So Augusta would eventually fall back to sleep that night, and she would get up in the morning and she would not tell her daughter, Henrietta, anything about this dream she had had. She played it off like everything was just fine. But over the course of the day, Henrietta, even though she didn't say anything, began to notice that her mom was just acting really weird, like something was on her mind. And finally, at night, when the two of them sat down for dinner, this is basically, 24 hours, give or take, from when Augusta had this dream, right? They're sitting down for dinner, and Augusta, she's not eating, she seems totally disconnected, and she just seems off. And Henrietta's like, "Mom, what is going on with you?" And Augusta, at this point, realized she must be giving off very negative vibes here. And so she told her daughter, "Don't worry, I'm fine, I'm sorry, I'm not hungry. Everything's fine, I'm just feeling a little bit off. So everything's fine." But Henrietta realistically did not believe her mom, but she didn't push her. She said, okay. And they finished their dinner, and then before long, Augusta had gone to bed. But the next morning, when Henrietta got up, she went downstairs expecting to see her mom, but Augusta was nowhere to be found. And so again, feeling kind of concerned about her mom's behavior, she went to Augusta's bedroom to check on her, and she found her mom seeming really weak and lethargic and just totally out of it, laying in bed. And she asked her mom, really, what's going on with you? Are you not feeling well? What's happening here? And her mom just said, I just don't want to get out of bed. I'm feeling under the weather. I'm going to stay here. But even though Henrietta could see her mom was clearly downplaying this, she just felt like there's too many red flags. So she called a doctor. And a doctor came to the house, and a doctor examined Augusta, and they determined that, it wasn't really clear exactly what was going on with her. Clearly she's not feeling great, but the only thing they found was that her heart sounded a little bit weak. And so the doctor suggested that Augusta just, rest, have some water, eat some food, and just stay in bed, and you should get better. But despite Augusta doing what the doctor said and basically remaining on bed rest, she didn't get better. And in fact, Henrietta, her daughter, is watching, and she's clearly seeing that not only is her mother deteriorating physically, but she was also becoming more and more despondent and sort of disconnected emotionally. It was like she was drifting off into some other world that Henrietta was not a part of, and she was just so worried about her mom. And so finally, on December 7th, so this is for reference, 5 days after Augusta had that visceral nightmare that she felt like she couldn't share with anybody, Henrietta went into her mother's room and she sat on the edge of the bed and she said to her mom, "You gotta tell me what's going on. It seems like there's something else here that you're not sharing with me. You gotta tell me. I don't care what it is, but I gotta know." Augusta, when she heard her daughter saying this, she sort of thought about trying to keep doing the same thing she was doing, which was, basically say everything's fine and push her daughter off. But she could tell Henrietta was not gonna take that for an answer. And so Augusta sighed and she said, "I had that dream again. Except this time, I watched the procedure." Now, to us, this is, cryptic and weird and doesn't really mean anything. But to Henrietta, who understood what her mom was talking about, she was completely horrified. It would turn out Augusta really did have horrible nightmares that plagued her for at least the last year or so. But it was like a recurring nightmare. She didn't have different variations. It basically was the exact same nightmare that just really upset her. The way it went is, she would open her eyes in this nightmare, and in front of her would be these two bottomless pits, these huge holes in the ground. Now, she wouldn't know what these holes are, but she'd be able to tell that she was in an environment that she recognized. One time she saw that she was in her sister-in-law's garden. Another time she saw she was in her neighbor's backyard. She knew where she was, but she didn't understand these holes. But in this nightmare, she would always walk up to the holes, and then she, not two men who walked in, but she would take a rug out and cover up one of those holes, and then she'd wake up. Now, on its face, this does not sound like a particularly frightening dream. But there's a connection to the real world that made it frightening. Every time Augusta would have these nightmares, the person who lived at the property where the dream took place, the sister-in-law's garden, the neighbor's backyard, when she would have that dream, she would come to, and then within a couple of days, that person would die, usually inexplicably. It was like a harbinger of doom that these dreams represented who was gonna die next. And so every time she had this dream, she knew someone's gonna die. But in that last dream she had, the one, 5 days earlier that scared her so badly, she knew she couldn't tell Henrietta. In that dream, it was the first time she, Augusta, didn't perform the procedure, i.e. putting the rug over one of the holes. Those two men came over and they did it. And Augusta realized she's sitting with her feet in the other hole, and she's realizing she's in her daughter's basement. That's where this dream's taking place. This must mean she, Augusta, is next. And wouldn't you know it, just days after telling her daughter about this, within 2 weeks of having this dream, Augusta died of heart failure in her daughter's house.
In 2017, 27-year-old Lydia Makarchuk left her home country of Ukraine and moved to Bracknell, which is a town just outside of London. Shortly after moving into her new apartment, Lydia went out and got a job as an accountant at a local hotel, and then after that, Lydia pretty much swore off her social life and instead just focused exclusively on working hard and saving money. The one reprieve she got from work was going to church on Sundays. 2 years later, Lydia was at her church enjoying the coffee hour that always followed the Sunday sermon when another member of her church, who she didn't really speak to, this 41-year-old man named Norbert Varga, approached her and kind of awkwardly complimented her shoes. And she was so flattered by this that it opened up a friendly conversation between the two of them. And during this conversation, Lydia was pleasantly surprised to find out that Norbert was an expat too. An expat is someone who lives outside of their native country. Norbert had moved to the UK in 2018, so that's 1 year after Lydia had moved to the UK, and he came from Hungary, which shares a border with Ukraine.
And just like Lydia, when he got to the UK, he kind of put all his energy into his work and trying to save money. He was a radio technician and a photographer. And so the two spend the rest of this coffee hour chatting and enjoying each other's company. And then afterwards, when they left the church and they both got home, they both found themselves thinking about the other. There was clearly an attraction there. And so the following Sunday, they both very eagerly rushed back to church in order to spend more time together. And sure enough, during that coffee hour, they spent the whole time together just chatting it up. And then afterwards, they exchanged phone numbers and made plans to get together outside of church. They were going to go on a date. And so the rest, as they say, is history. 2 years after Norbert complimented Lydia's shoes, they got married in Bracknell. And while the wedding was great, unfortunately, none of Lydia's family members, who were all in Ukraine, none of them could attend the actual wedding. And so the newlywed couple decided the way they would handle that is their honeymoon would be spent in Ukraine. That way Lydia's family could celebrate their wedding as well. For a variety of reasons, this honeymoon trip to Ukraine kept getting pushed back, but finally in September of 2021, everything lined up, everyone was available, and so Norbert and Lydia rushed to the airport and they hopped on a flight. And during this flight to Ukraine, Lydia remembers being so excited specifically about her husband finally getting a chance to spend some time with her 29-year-old younger brother Miroslav. Lydia was very close with her brother, and so it mattered to her greatly that he and her husband had a good relationship. But to that point, because of the great physical distance between the UK and Ukraine, the two had really not had that much interaction, and so they really didn't know each other very well. And so this trip was really important to Lydia, and Miroslav, he really picked up on that because he put together this camping trip for the end of their stay in Ukraine, where he knew he'd be able to step aside with Norbert and chat with him and get to know him a little bit. And so that was kind of like the fail-safe, where if he and Norbert did not get a chance to speak all week because they were visiting with so many people, they would have a chance to at the end of the week on this camping trip. So after a few hours of flying, Lydia and Norbert touch down in Ukraine, and they make their way to Lydia's family's house where they're going to be staying for the week. And that night, and for the next several days, the couple was swamped with several family reunions and meetups with old friends that hadn't seen Lydia in years. And so Norbert and Miroslav were not getting any time to themselves, and Lydia really knew that. And so she and Norbert began looking forward to this camping trip because that not only represented a kind of peaceful break from the chaos of all these reunions, but it also did represent the one chance they knew Miroslav and Norbert would get to interact with each other. And so finally, September 15th, the end of the week, it came, and it was time to go on this camping trip. And so Lydia and Norbert and Miroslav and 9 other family members, they all packed up their tents and their camping belongings, and they loaded up a couple of cars, and they drove over to the base of the Carpathian mountain range. This mountain range, which stretches for nearly 1,000 miles across Eastern and Central Europe, are very popular amongst tourists because it's stunningly beautiful. Everything is green and lush, and there are these crystal clear lakes and breathtaking waterfalls and all these amazing animals running around, and there's no mosquitoes, and they have these really cool hikes that bring you up to these very impressive overlooks. And so that night, Miroslav had made reservations for this one campsite, this very popular campsite that was up in this clearing, not too far up the mountain, and it had this great view down to the forest below, and because it was in a clearing, it had this unobstructed view up to the sky where in this area, you could look up and just see stars in every direction. And so when Lydia and the rest of this group arrive in the parking lot of this mountain range, they were all really excited to get up to this campsite and just enjoy being there. And so they park their cars, they get their gear out, they find the trailhead, and then they begin hiking up the mountain. And about 2 hours later, they arrive at this clearing. They find their campsite, which was marked by this small fire pit underneath a couple of trees. And so they go over and they set their tents up, and some people go out and get some firewood. And then before long, a fire was made, and this group of 12 people that had not seen each other in so long, they just sat down and began enjoying each other's company. They put tea on, they were swapping stories. It was really just this wonderful time. And then around 8 p.m., the sun started to set, at which point this huge group just stopped and enjoyed this beautiful sunset. And then once the sun had gone down, there were 2 kids that were there on this trip, and so they were put to bed in their tent. And then the remaining 10 adults just kind of hung out by the fire and enjoyed each other's company. And it was actually during this second half of the night that Norbert and Miroslav finally really got a chance to just chat with each other. So for about an hour, they were talking to each other, and Lydia is just watching this happen, and she couldn't be happier. This is like the perfect ending to this trip. And then around 9 p.m., Norbert stands up. Lydia sees him stand up, and he tells the group he's going to run back back to his tent, which was a ways away from the campfire, and he was going to get his camera. And so Lydia said, okay, no problem. And she remembers watching him walk off into the distance, because when you're at the campfire, if you're looking away from the campfire, everything is pitch black in that direction. And so she watches him disappear into the darkness, and then she and her brother and everyone else just kind of turn back towards the campfire. And then all she remembers about what happens next is she heard a whistling sound. And at first it was very faint, but it started to get very, very loud. And when it got loud, she tried to kind of figure out where it was. But before she could, suddenly something hit her in the face, predominantly hit her in the nose. And as soon as it did, she went blind, she went deaf, and then she felt herself on the ground, and she has no idea what's going on. And all she can remember thinking is, oh my God, something horrible has happened to me. I might die. I don't know what's happening, but I might die. And so she started praying for herself to survive whatever was happening to her. And then her hearing started to come back just a little bit. Her vision was still totally blurred. She could only kind of tell where the fire was because it was bright, but her hearing, it started to come back. And that's when she heard moaning coming from somewhere near her. And so she's thinking, okay, whatever horrible thing has happened to me has happened to other people too. And so instead of just praying for herself, she began praying for everyone who was at this campsite. And so as her hearing is getting louder and louder, and she's hearing more and more moaning and crying happening all around her, she suddenly hears her husband screaming her name. Her vision is still gone, but she knows it's him, and he lands right behind her and he grabs her and he's just repeating her name over and over and over again. And then Lydia manages to kind of choke out to her husband, what happened? And there's a pause, and then Norbert says to her, it's bad. It's really bad. It would turn out their campsite was on a battlefield from World War I. And buried underneath the soil, right under their fire pit, was an unexploded bomb from World War I. Meaning, for over 100 years, countless campers have arrived at this campsite and lit fires on top of this bomb that they couldn't see. And each fire gradually eroded the outer metal casing of this explosive, until finally that night in September, with Lydia and 11 of her loved ones nearby, their little fire finally was it. It pushed through that last little bit of the casing, and it ignited the bomb, and it detonated. That whistling that she heard was the sound of the fire finally cutting through that casing and being exposed to the fire. And then that thing that struck her in the face, that hit her right on the nose, that was almost certainly a piece of the bomb itself, so shrapnel that was cutting through her face. And then the moaning she heard was primarily her brother, who was right next to her. Lydia would be gravely wounded, but she would survive. As for her brother and another man who was not named, they would not survive. Here is a picture that was taken of the group literally minutes before this bomb detonated. At 11:40 a.m. on December 21st, 2003, three young men who were longtime childhood friends hopped in a truck and began traveling south. They were 22-year-old Brett Mann and 19-year-olds Sean Blowers and Ashley McGuff. They lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is actually the capital of the Northern Territory in Australia. The Northern Territory, also known as the Top End, is located in the central north of the continent. It is 6 times larger than the UK, but has 280 times less people living in it. Specifically, the UK is home to roughly 70 million people, whereas the Top End is home to only 250,000 people, and half of them live in Darwin. There are many reasons why the Top End is so underpopulated, ranging from politics to poor infrastructure, but the most obvious reason that so few people choose to live in this part of Australia is because it is wildly rugged and dangerous. It is scorchingly hot year-round, and the weather in general is just unbelievably unpredictable and violent. And as the old saying goes, all the animals there are trying to kill you and each other. But Brett, Sean, and Ashley had grown up in Darwin, and so they were accustomed to the hazards of living in the Top End, and so they weren't really concerned about them. What they were concerned with was finding things to do and not getting bored in the city. That particular day, in order to ward off boredom, the trio had decided they would head out to a salt flat that was located about 50 miles to the southwest of Darwin. It was this wide open plain lane that they could just race around on their quad bikes on. And so they loaded these quad bikes into their trailer, attached it to their truck, they hopped in their truck, and at 11:40 a.m., they started heading south out of Darwin. The first road they were on was this fairly desolate dirt road that wound around through the wilderness, and it passed by the iconic eucalyptus trees that are very well known in Australia. It passed by palm trees and giant termite mounds. And after driving on this dirt road for about 30 minutes, the trio passed by the Tumbling Waters Holiday Park, which is a vacation resort for adventurous families. And then beyond this park, there really was no more civilization. They were headed right into the outback of Australia. And so this was kind of like the last mark of civilization. And so the trio, they drive for another 30 minutes past the park. And at some point, all of the trees on either side of the road start getting more and more dense until they begin kind of encroaching over the road, as if it looks like you're driving directly through the heart of a jungle. And they would have recognized this change in scenery as meaning they were nearing the Finnis River, which was off to their right beyond all of the trees. So they couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And the Finnis River was not a huge waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch that ran east to west through the top end. And what it was known for was being very brackish and dark. You could not see into this water more than maybe an inch or two, so it almost appeared black. And so the trio continued driving along through this kind of jungle atmosphere until the left side of the road began to thin out again, and then it eventually revealed the salt flats up to their left. And so at that point, the trio pulled off on the right side of the road where the vegetation was still very thick. And then the trio hopped out of the truck, they went around to their trailer, they dropped the gate, and one by one they pulled their quad bikes off, and then each of them hopped on and drove out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually very muddy because it had recently rained really heavy in that area. And so the trio spent just as much time racing each other on the flats as they did trying to drive close to each other and spray mud on each other. And so for hours, they were out there having a great time. And then at 4:30 p.m., they decided it was time to call it a day. And so they drove back over to the truck. They drove their quad bikes up onto the trailer. They locked it. And then they were about to get into the truck to head back home when one of them suggested, hey, let's head down to the water and rinse our clothes off and get all this mud off of us. Now, you need to understand, in the top end, the place you want to spend the least amount of time in is the water. People in the top end assume that in any natural water body that is not clearly designated as a swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution people in the top end take. And so this section of the Finnis River that these three friends were thinking about going and jumping into and washing off inside of, this was not a clearly designated swimming area, and so it should be avoided. But you need to remember, these three guys, they grew up in the top end. They were used to living in this kind of wild area, and they'd also come to the salt flats so many times over the years, and they had jumped into the Finnis River before to wash off and go swimming, and nothing had ever happened. And so really, the idea that the Finnis River could be dangerous to them, it didn't really cross their mind. They felt like, you know what, we've been there, done that, nothing's gonna happen to us. And so they left the truck and walked away from the salt flats into this mangrove forest that's only a couple of feet off the road and began walking towards this river. Normally, the trip from the road through the forest to the river bank, basically where the forest ended and you reach the river, it would take about 10 minutes. But after walking in this mangrove for maybe a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches of this water, but it signaled to the guys that clearly the river is very swollen from all of the recent rains, enough so that it overflowed beyond its natural boundaries and it's flooded the mangrove forest. But the three guys, they look at each other and think, meh, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so the guys continued moving on, but as the mangroves began to thin out, they began to slow down dramatically because the riverbanks on the edges of the Finnis River were very steep. If you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the Finnis River, if you took even 1 or 2 steps into the river, you would slip down under the water and the water would be over your head. Now, as these guys are walking, walking, because the ground is flooded with this black, brackish water, they couldn't see the ground, and so they couldn't tell where the drop-off into the river was. And so they began to slow down, and then when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were close, and then one of them actually slipped and kind of tumbled down the edge for a second, but he turned and he grabbed one of the roots of the mangrove tree and pulled himself back up. And then the other two, after seeing this, they walked over and stood next to him, and the trio just stood there looking out at this pitch black looking river that was very clearly moving faster than normal because of all this excess rain. But they kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. We'll hold on to the roots of these mangroves and lower ourselves over the embankment. We'll wash ourselves off, pull ourselves back up. No big deal. And so they each turned around and grabbed a root of one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of this forest, and while holding on, they would lower their lower half down past the embankment until they were submerged. They rubbed all the mud off of themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove at any point. And then as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back up and get back to their truck, Brett loses his balance and somehow lets go of the mangrove root and slips down the steep embankment, and suddenly the current takes him away from his friends and out to the middle of this river, and before long he's getting pulled downstream. And so he yells out to Ashley and Sean, who had their backs turned to him. They turn around, they see their friend, and they instinctively leap into the river to try to go get him and help swim him back to the side. Now all three of them were very competent swimmers, and so this was not a high panic situation. This was more like a inconvenience and maybe a little bit funny, and so that's why they leapt in no problem. They figured, worst case scenario is we'll drift somewhere down there and we'll get out and we'll walk our way back to our car. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in this river, they felt how strong this current was, and it was way stronger than they were anticipating. And so they actually started to get a little bit worried, and they looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for 10 or 15 seconds before they leapt in, he had already moved way farther downstream than them. And so they decided, you know what, we have to get out, but we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. And so they decide they're going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly can. And so they yell out to Brett hey, we're coming to get you. And they start swimming as fast as they possibly can. And with the help of the current, they manage to get all the way up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe a couple of minutes. And when they reach him, Sean and Ashley go in front of Brett. And then the three of them, they stop actively swimming and they allow the current to just kind of carry them downstream. And as they're drifting, they begin scouting the left side of the river for a solid clump of mangrove trees they can swim into, because unless there's something to grab onto on the edge of this river, they can't pull themselves out. And so at this point, the trio is definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current is, but they're confident they're going to find a viable landing spot and they're going to get out of here and it will be a great story. And so Sean is in the front, Ashley is right behind him, and then Brett is behind Ashley. And they're all about an arm's length away from each other. And they're drifting down this river for a couple of minutes. They're looking on the left side for a viable landing spot. And then all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, hey, I see something in the water. We need to get out. Find the nearest tree. Get out, get out, get out. And so Sean, he starts panicking. He doesn't even turn around to see what's going on behind him. Adrenaline kicks in and he swims as fast as he possibly can to a tree that's popped out of the river. It's literally growing in the middle of the river. And so he swims up to this tree. He manages to climb up to the first fork of the tree, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water. And as soon as he's up there, he turns around and looks down and he sees Ashley. He reaches down and he hoists Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then the pair turn around again to grab Brett, but Brett's not there. And so they look around, they're thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around? Is he at some other tree? They're yelling out for him, they're looking for him, but there's no Brett. And so they're talking to each other, Ashley and Sean. They're saying, hey, did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give some indication about where he was going? And they're saying, no, I don't know where he is. And so they start climbing up the tree a little bit and trying to look down and up the river to see if maybe they can see him. And then all of a sudden, Sean notices something yellow flash beneath them in the water. And so he looks straight down and he sees this yellow thing down there. And so he nudges Ashley and he says, look. And so Ashley looks down, and as they're looking, they're about 10 feet off the water at this point. They see this yellow thing start rising up to the surface. Now, the water is so dark, they really can't tell what anything is unless it is at the surface. And so they're watching this yellow thing, and suddenly it comes out of the water, and they see It's Brett. He's got his yellow jacket on. That's what they saw. And Brett is in the mouth of a 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. He is face down and his left side is being held in this animal's mouth and he's not moving. And so Sean and Ashley are so scared, they're just frozen. They're just staring at this monster that's in the water, that's holding their friend underwater, and they can't do anything about it. And for 2 minutes, they just stand there looking at this animal, wondering what's going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them once they got in the water. That I've done this to your friend, I'm getting you to as well. And so they're staring at this animal when suddenly it just kind of goes underneath the water, back down into the black abyss, and it, along with Brett, just disappear. Ashley and Sean are so terrified that they can't even grieve for their friend. They can't feel sad for him. It's like they just go into survival mode. And without saying anything to each other, they just start climbing up this tree as fast and as far as they possibly can. And they only manage to get up maybe a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One's at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other is at about 15 feet off the water. And so Sean makes it onto the lower branch, and then Ashley makes it onto the slightly higher branch. And then once they're situated on their branch and one arm is firmly wrapped around the trunk of the tree, they're able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room here is that their friend was just eaten by a crocodile, but it's like they can't process that yet. Instead, they start talking about, okay, well, our families, they're going to recognize our absence and they're going to tell the police, and the police are going to launch a search and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or they acted confident, that that was going to happen, but they also knew that there was no timeline for this. It could be hours or days until this actually happened. And so as these two teens are sitting on their branches, the reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them. Because yeah, they're safe in this tree, but how long can they possibly stay in this tree for? I mean, eventually they're going to need to fall asleep. And if they fall asleep, are they going to fall out of the tree and land in the water with this crocodile? I mean, they just didn't know how this was going to turn out. And so as the two began comforting each other, you know, reassuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine. Someone's going to find us tonight or tomorrow. We'll be just fine. As they're doing that, Ashley suddenly stops talking to Sean and just looks straight down. And so Sean realizes what Ashley's doing and he matches his gaze. And he looks straight down, and at the base of their tree, in that black water, is the 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. It's back, and it no longer has Brett in its mouth. They have no idea where Brett is. He's just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the world. And they are one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when given a chance. And so these 2 teens are helpless in this tree. All they have is some separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so they just find themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, this crocodile just stares right back up at them. It's very clearly waiting for them. It wants them to come out of the tree so it can eat them. And so the crocodile just continuously repositions itself all around the tree. It's just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes can look up at them. And so the teens are just praying that at some point it will grow tired of them and will leave. And after several hours, right as the sun is about to set, this crocodile does seem to give up on them and it drifts under the water and disappears. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decides he doesn't want to be any closer to the water than he needs to be, and he's going to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so he very carefully stands up on his branch. He makes sure he's got solid footing, and then he reaches up and he grabs a branch with his right hand, and he kind of tests it, and he feels like it's pretty sturdy, and then he puts all his weight on it and tries to reach for another branch when this one breaks. And as soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet into the water. And so he hits the water, he goes all the way under, he sinks a few feet under, and immediately he's turned around and he's trying to swim as fast as he can to the surface, and he's just expecting at any moment this crocodile is going to bite him. He gets to the surface and he looks around. It's a little bit dark, but he can immediately see his tree, and he realizes the current has pulled him away from his tree. And so in a panic, he starts swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly can to get back to this tree. And he knows the whole time he's kicking his legs, he's just attracting the attention of this crocodile, but he's got nothing else he can do. He's got no other tree he can reasonably get to that will provide safety from this animal. And so with every ounce of energy he's got, he kicks and swims, and finally he manages to grab a root of this tree that his friend is still inside of, and he begins pulling himself with his lower half still submerged in the water. And so as he's dragging himself towards the trunk of this tree, he's just waiting for this crocodile to bite down on his legs, and finally he gets to the trunk of the tree and he's able to pull his body out of the water, and he clambers up to that original branch he was on, and then he and Ashley work to get him up to Ashley's branch. And as soon as he sits down next to Ashley and he's secure, they both look down, and just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the area where Sean had just landed in the water, they see with the little light that is left, this crocodile swimming right back over to the tree, and it camps out right underneath. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black. There's no ambient light in this part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area, and so it is truly pitch black. And so they could no longer see the crocodile down below. But they knew it was there because periodically they would hear it repositioning itself right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens could not actually see each other. And so they began holding on to each other, and then anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other, just so they knew they had not fallen asleep and were not falling out of the tree to a horrible death. And so a few hours went by like this, where it was silence with the exception of the sounds of this crocodile repositioning itself periodically. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into this area, and it began absolutely downpouring, and the raindrops that were hitting the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of this crocodile, and so they had no idea if it was still down below them or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the sky for that flash of a second, and in that flash they would look down, and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river all the way up high enough that this crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water, and so they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so they both kind of sucked their legs up onto this branch and tried to make themselves as small as they could while still remaining anchored to each other and also to the branch, and that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up that following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree waiting for them, and they also noticed the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that another heavy rainstorm, that crocodile would be in range of them, and there was nowhere they could go. They were as high up as they could get. Not to mention the fact they were hypothermic, they were weak, they were tired, and if you fall asleep, you're going to fall in the water. And so the two teens, they knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning a search had been launched. They had found their truck and then had been walking down the river yelling out to them, and then they finally did find them. Initially, when they located these two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lower down a ladder that could climb back up. But when the helicopter got close to this tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades, it practically blew the boys out of the tree, and this crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it, the boys could still see it, and so there was this fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. And so they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the blades of that helicopter did ultimately scare this crocodile, and the crocodile swam away. And so as soon as the helicopter was off station, they had a boat come in, and the boat got right underneath the two boys. They jumped down into it, and they were brought to safety. The two boys were brought to a hospital where doctors determined they were physically okay, but both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body or any of his clothing or any belongings he had on him, and they never found the crocodile that killed him.
In 2019, a 32-year-old United States Army soldier was stationed in Hawaii for training. This was his first time ever being in Hawaii, and so on his first day off, he planned to do some sightseeing. After doing some research, he settled on the Hawaii Volcano National Park as the first place he would go check out. This is one of the top tourist attractions in Hawaii that sees over 2 million yearly visitors. One of the main draws of this particular park is that it's home to one of the world's most active volcanoes, the Kilauea, that has been erupting consistently almost every year since 1983. On the evening of Wednesday, May 1st, John finally was given some time off, and so he hopped in his rental car and he made his way out to the park. When he got there, he was pleasantly surprised to see that it was not crowded in the least, most likely because he was there midweek. And so he paid his entrance fee, and then he started walking up a trail that would bring him up to this overlook that overlooked the caldera. The caldera of a volcano is the actual crater, the inside of the volcano where the actual lava comes out of. At the time John was at the park, the volcano was not actively erupting, and so there was no pool of lava inside of the caldera. However, the surface of the caldera, which was 300 feet below this overlook where John is, the surface was still 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing these massive steam clouds to billow up from it pretty much constantly. And so when John actually reached this overlook point and was looking out into the caldera, he was immediately disappointed because he couldn't see anything. And so as much as John craned his neck to try to get a better look down into the caldera, he was just totally obscured by the steam. Now, he was up against a safety railing that prevented people from getting closer, but he figured if he could just get right to the edge of this crater and he could actually look down inside, he might be able to see all the way to the base of the caldera. And so he looked around and noticed there were no other tourists up there with him. So he thought about it for a second and then decided, yep, I'm gonna do this. And he stepped over the safety railing and walked right to the edge of this crater overlooking this caldera. And as soon as he got there, he suddenly had this unencumbered view of the space directly at the bottom of the edge of the cliff. He could actually see down into the caldera now. And so he got his phone out and he started taking some pictures, and then all of a sudden the ground underneath him began to shift, and it shifted so quickly and so suddenly that threw him onto his back. And as he's laying on his back scrambling to get back up again, the ground underneath him just completely collapses, sending him careening down 300 feet into the scalding hot caldera. When John fell, another tourist did happen to walk up another nearby trail, and they actually saw him as he fell. And so they called 911, and immediately first responders were on scene, but they were facing the same issue that John was, which is the steam was so intense inside of this volcano that you can't really see down into it. And so they had rescuers walking along the rim of the volcano, and they had helicopters in the air, but it really wasn't doing any good. And in the back of all rescuers' minds, they knew that realistically, there's just no way John could have survived this. I mean, you can't survive a 300-foot fall, but even if you did, you couldn't survive being at the surface of the caldera that's over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd die within a couple of minutes. But the rescuers pushed that thought out of their mind, and they focused on being positive and just continuing to look for John. And 2 hours into their search, when it was totally dark outside and hope was just about gone at this point, somebody spotted John on a little ledge jutting out 70 feet down from that cliff he was standing on. When he fell, when the ground dissolved underneath him, he managed to land on this tiny little ledge. Had he fallen an inch left, an inch right, an inch forward, he would have tumbled to his death. There's no two ways about it. But he landed perfectly on the one ledge that could have saved his life. But he was so badly injured, he couldn't climb back up again. However, rescuers were able to rappel down to him, put him in a harness, get him back up, and he was able to make a full recovery. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged
rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they're just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around. He's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before when they were up in the tree, even then, it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son and he puts his son down by a tree and he sits down next to him and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes, there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by, presumably, his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? So he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction and, holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found, at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. When most people picture Russia in their minds, they picture European Russia, which is literally the part of Russia on the western side that sits in Europe and is by far the most populated part of the country. But European Russia only accounts for 23% of the total territory that is Russia. The other 77% is to the east of European Russia. It starts at the Ural mountain range and it extends all the way over 5 million square miles to the Pacific Ocean. And this vast, mostly forested expanse, which is 50 times bigger than the entire United Kingdom, is called Siberia. And Siberia is absolutely brutal. In Siberia, it is almost always freezing cold. Literally, the average annual temperature across all of Siberia is 32.9 degrees Fahrenheit, so it is 0.9 degrees above freezing on average every single day. In addition to the extremely deadly weather that exists basically year-round in Siberia, Siberia is also home to a bunch of huge deadly animals, such as the brown bear, which is the same as the infamous grizzly bear in North America, the gray wolf, which by size alone makes virtually all other wolves look like little puppies. Gray wolves can grow to be nearly 200 pounds. And of course, there is the highly intelligent Siberian tiger, who is perhaps one of the only predators on Earth that is known to seek out and kill people for revenge. For example, in 1997, a hunter named Vladimir Markov was walking through a Siberian forest when he came face to face with one of these Siberian tigers, and he ended up shooting the tiger before fleeing, except the tiger didn't die. Instead, it got up and secretly followed Vladimir all the way back to his cabin, and then this tiger camped out outside of the cabin until Vladimir came out again, and the tiger pounced, killed him, and ate him. And so, unsurprisingly, Siberia has an absolutely minuscule population relative to its massive size. However, there are some adventurous people out there who are drawn to Siberia for the same reasons that most other people avoid it. These adventurous people see Siberia as one of the last truly wild places on our planet, and they want to experience it for themselves. And one of these highly adventurous people was a young man named Colin Madsen. Colin, who came from a very successful American family, was a big outdoors enthusiast who at some point in his youth began researching Siberia because he fell in love with its rugged natural beauty. He quickly began researching not only Siberia, but Siberian culture and Russian culture, and also at some point he became fluent in the Russian language. Then, in 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he left his home in Missouri and moved to Siberia. He settled in one of Siberia's few population centers, a city called Irkutsk, which is located in the southeast of Siberia and right along the edge of Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest freshwater lake. Colin's Siberia plan was twofold. He would go to school while he was there, and he would go out and explore. And at first, his plan went perfectly. He was accepted into Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, and very quickly he made friends who were eager to accompany him on his adventures out into the Siberian wilderness. From his arrival in Siberia in 2013 to 2016, Colin did well in his studies, and he spent countless hours exploring the forests and mountainous areas all around Lake Baikal and right outside of Irkutsk. In fact, Colin became so familiar with this region that he began volunteering with a nonprofit in the area that went around marking new trails, which meant Colin was literally venturing into the wilds of Siberia and just marking the trail as he went. So when Colin's family heard about what happened to him in 2016, they could not believe it. In March of 2016, Colin and 3 of his good hiking friends, one was American and 2 were Russian, decided they wanted to go on a hike together. They settled on hiking to the summit of Love Peak, which was a mountain located a few hours away from Irkutsk in a small village called Arshan. This hike was nothing compared to the gnarly Siberian wilderness hikes all 4 of these guys had been on before. The trail that led up to Love Peak, it was fairly steep, but it was incredibly well marked, and all 4 of these guys had hiked it several times before. However, because Colin and his friends were so experienced at hiking in Siberia, they knew that even the easiest hikes needed to be respected, because Siberia was still Siberia. There were dangers that lurked everywhere. And so the men called ahead to the village of Arshan, and they rented one of these small rustic cabins that's in the village that sits right at the base of Love Peak, and it's kind of tucked away in this forest. And so this cabin would serve as their sort of base camp and would allow them to arrive in Arshan, get their gear together, and then when they were ready, they could begin this hike to the summit. And so a few days later, on March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends loaded up their car and they drove west to Arshan. And when they got there, they stopped at a local store and got some supplies and then made their way to their cabin. Their cabin was just a single room with a few beds inside of it. It was enough to protect them from the elements, but really nothing more. As for a toilet, the cabin didn't have one, but there was an outhouse outside that they could use. So after the friends moved into the cabin and claimed their beds and put their things down, they all sat down and began prepping their gear and eating some food and chatting. And then finally, at 2 a.m., they decided they needed to go to sleep because their plan was to get on the path up to Love Peak by 7 a.m., which meant they needed to get up at 5 a.m. to make their final preparations. So at 2 a.m., the lights in the cabin turned off and the friends all fell asleep. And then 3 hours later, at 5 a.m., when the lights came back on again, it was immediately clear something was wrong. Colin was not in his bed. His friends assumed, when they looked over at his bed and saw his personal belongings were all still there, that Colin must have gotten up and headed outside, maybe to use the outhouse or go for a quick walk, and they just hadn't heard him leaving. And so the 3 friends initially just kind of shrugged off Colin's absence and said, he'll be back any minute, most likely, and if for some reason he's not back soon, he'll certainly be back by 7 a.m., because that was the agreed upon time they would leave for this hike. But as the minutes ticked closer and closer to 7 a.m., and Colin still had not shown up or tried to call them or do anything, the friends started to worry. It just didn't make any sense that Colin would just get up and leave without telling them where he was going. Finally, at 7 a.m., when Colin still had not shown up, and the friends' cursory search of the outside area near the cabin had yielded no results, they decided they had to tell someone. And so they wrote a note addressed to Colin, and they put it on the front of their cabin door. And this note basically just told Colin, if you come back here and you see this note, know that we're looking for you. So stay put or tell someone you're here. And so after putting up this note, the friends left the cabin and they headed to the nearest police station where they reported Colin missing. The police would eventually launch this huge search in and around Arshan, both in the forested area right around the village and then also up into the mountains near Love Peak. But despite this huge effort, no one could find Colin, at least not at first. On Monday, April 4th, so 8 days into Colin's disappearance, a group of searchers were looking in the forest about 1 mile away from the cabin where Colin and his friends had been staying. And they look up ahead and they see there is this clearing and there's something in the middle of it. And so the searchers begin moving their way towards this clearing, ducking under branches and stepping over brush. And when they get close enough, they can see Colin is in the clearing, and Colin is deceased. He was laying flat on his back with his left arm extended out to the side and his right arm extended but closer to his body, and both of his hands were clenched in tight fists. And on his hands and his wrists were visible abrasions and cuts, which later would be determined to have most likely been caused from someone or something holding onto him, trying to restrain Colin. Colin also had visible abrasions and cuts on the front of his neck. Colin's clothing, which consisted of a long-sleeve thermal shirt, heavy pants, and hiking boots, were ripped and torn in several places. And interestingly, Colin was not wearing socks under his boots. Now that seems inconsequential, but Colin had had surgery on both of his ankles and had scar tissue on his ankles that if he didn't have socks on, those scars would rub against the inside of his boot, and he said it was very painful. So he always wore socks. Also, Colin's body showed virtually no signs of decomposition, and all of his wounds and abrasions looked, quote, fresh, according to medical personnel. In short, Colin looked like he had recently been in some sort of physical altercation, and whoever or whatever he was grappling with had eventually overpowered him and killed him, although it was not clear how he actually died. Russian authorities were very quick to suspect Colin's 3 friends who had been with him, but they were brought into the station and they denied having anything to do with Colin's death, and they all passed their lie detector tests. After that, Russian authorities quickly closed this case by concluding that, well, if his friends didn't do it, then that means Colin must have been high on drugs or drinking alcohol or both, and he just wandered out of his cabin and he got lost in the woods and he died of hypothermia. He froze to death. The end. However, Colin's parents just could not accept that as being what happened to their son. There were a lot of reasons for skepticism, but the main one was that Colin was an absolute expert at navigating this particular region of Siberia. And so the idea that he would leave his cabin for a quick walk or something and get so completely lost that he would die 8 days later seemed way too far-fetched. And so Colin's parents hired a US-based private lab to do a review of Russia's autopsy of Colin to give their opinion if the autopsy was accurate or not. And this US-based lab pretty much immediately found that the Russian autopsy was not remotely accurate. Number 1, Colin was not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. He was sober. Although technically he did have very small amounts of THC in his urine. THC is the chemical that is found in marijuana, but the amount was so little, it basically meant he had consumed the THC days before he went missing. And so he would not have been remotely affected by that small amount of THC in his system. Number 2, the lab determined that Colin almost certainly did not die from hypothermia. Instead, all signs pointed to Colin dying from being suffocated, meaning he was murdered. Someone crushed his airway or in some way restricted him from breathing, and that's what killed him. And 3, based on the lack of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries on Colin's body, and the lack of animal predation on his body when they found him, indicated that Colin did not just wander out of his cabin and immediately die somewhere in the forest. Instead, he was alive for most of the time people were looking for him, meaning when they found him, he likely had died within hours of being found. And so these findings by this US-based lab kind of create a general theory about what must have happened to Colin. After Colin left the cabin in the early morning hours of March 28th, maybe to go to the outhouse or to go for a quick walk, when he went outside, someone or something was nearby, and they either lured Colin to them or they straight up ambushed Colin and took him away. Now, we have no idea what happened to Colin after he was abducted, but we can safely assume that after being abducted and taken somewhere, he was alive, and he stayed alive for several days until on the 8th day of his disappearance, Colin was killed, likely by his captor, either at the spot where he was found, or he was killed somewhere else, maybe in the forest, and then moved to the spot where he was found. Many people believe it was the Russian government who targeted Colin, they kidnapped him, and they killed him. And their botched investigation into his death was actually a calculated cover-up. Colin had participated in at least one peaceful environmentalist-led protest in Siberia, and after the protest, Colin apparently got a written warning by the Russian police not to attend another protest. But why would Colin, who was just one of many people involved in these protests, be singled out by the Russian government and killed for his participation? And why would the government elect to kill Colin when he was with 3 of his closest friends who would immediately notice his absence? It just doesn't add up. Today, Colin's parents are still trying to figure out what happened to their son, but unfortunately, their son's case is closed in Russia, and so no one on the Russian side is talking to the parents or giving them any new information. And so as a result, they and the rest of us are left to wonder who or what was lurking in the shadows when Colin stepped out of the cabin that morning. And then where did they take him? And what did they do to him for nearly a week before they killed him deep inside of that Siberian forest?
Late at night on October 26, 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was sitting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio, when her phone rang. And the first thing she did when it rang was looked at the clock. It was 10:30 p.m. Like, this is not when people called her. And so worried something was wrong, she got up and she answered the phone and she said hello. And on the other end of the line, somebody said back, "Hey sis." And Ethel immediately knew who this was. It was not a sibling, despite the greeting, "Hey sis." It was someone that was very close with her and her husband, Dawn. In fact, this person who she was speaking to was Dawn's best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. And for decades, Lee and Ethel and Dawn had lived next to each other. They were neighbors, and basically every day they were at each other's houses together. I mean, they were super duper close. But Lee had eventually moved to another town, and so they didn't see each other as much, but they did get together a fair amount. And also Lee, very regularly, would call the house and just check in. And so Ethel's thinking, okay, it's a little bit late, 10:30 at night, but it's Lee, so clearly he's just calling to check in. But before Ethel could really even respond to his greeting of, "Hey sis," because that's what he called her, sis, he just kept on talking. It was as if, Ethel wasn't even there. He was just sort of delivering a message. He was like, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. Like, I've never felt this way before, and I really need your husband, Dawn, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then Lee hung up. And Ethel, after the phone call died, she was really confused because one, it seemed like a sort of normal catch-up call, but he's saying something that sounded really serious, that something's going on with him. But also two, what immediately stood out to her was, how did he know Dawn wasn't there at the moment? Like, he wasn't nearby. How could he have just guessed that Dawn wasn't home right now? Because Dawn wasn't. He was out. He was going to be home soon, but he was out at the time he said it. It was like he had this knowledge that he was gone. And so it just seemed odd that he knew that piece of information. And so because she was sort of confused by this call and worried about Lee, considering what he said, she tried calling him back. But Lee didn't answer. She tried several more times, never heard from Lee. And then eventually her husband, Dawn, he came home and she explained to him like, "Yeah, I got this weird call from Lee. He said, he wanted you to get in touch with him as soon as he came back because he's not feeling good or something. I don't really know." And so Dawn's like, "All right, that's weird." So he tries calling Lee and Lee doesn't answer. And so at this point, Dawn, he's like, "Ethel, go over it again. Like, what exactly did he say? Like, did he sound scared? Did he sound confused? Like, what was he talking about?" And Ethel said, like, "I don't know. He just sort of stated that he just didn't feel good and he had never felt this way before and he just really wanted to talk to you, Dawn. But again, he mentioned you were out of the house. I don't know how he knew that. And he said to have you call when you came back. That's really what happened. I don't understand it either." And so because Ethel and Dawn really didn't know what to make of this, and just given the fact that maybe Lee could be in trouble, they were like, "You know what? Let's just drive over to his house in the other town and just check on him. Just make sure he's okay." So they hop in the car, they drive to Lee's house, and Lee's not there. And so even though it was late at night, Ethel and Dawn really were worried about their friend, and so they began knocking on neighbors' doors to see if anybody knew where he was. But it would take a while, but eventually one of the neighbors said that Lee actually was at the hospital. And at this, Ethel and Dawn, it's like their worst fears are confirmed. Something really is wrong with their friend. And so they went to the nearest hospital, which is called Mercy Hospital. And when they got there, they learned that yes, Lee was admitted to the hospital, but unfortunately, he was dead. And this on its face was of course shocking news for Ethel and Dawn. I mean, they did not expect to find out that their friend of many decades was, abruptly and sort of inexplicably dead. But that was far from the most shocking thing they learned. When they spoke to the medical staff about what actually happened to Lee, they would eventually tell Ethel and Dawn that after some complications, Lee ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 p.m. the previous night. His actual time of death exactly coincided with the moment Ethel got that phone call from Lee, where he said to her, "I just don't feel right. I've never felt this way before. Please, when your husband Dawn gets home, have him call me." Ethel and Dawn have no way to prove this, but they believe that that phone call was actually Lee's spirit, his soul, trying to talk to his best friend one more time before he passed away. Thank you to DraftKings Sportsbook for sponsoring today's episode. I love to place bets during the playoffs, no matter the sport. The playoffs are just awesome. There's nothing like betting on a game when everything is on the line. It just makes it so much better. Do you love the thrill of live betting? Do you want to wager on the next big play or your favorite player's next move? Well, DraftKings has you covered. And there's even a special offer for new customers. Bet $5 and get paid in bonus bets if your bet wins. Minimum minus 500 odds required. Stay in on the action and use your bonus bets on DraftKings same-game parlays for a shot at an even bigger payout. And if for some reason sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't fret. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Pick 6 and have the shot to win cash prizes. New customers bet $5 and get extra bonus bets if your bet wins. Minimum minus 500 odds required. The crown is yours. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and sign up using promo code Mrballen. Again, that's promo code Mrballen. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma Qingmao and several of his family members walked out of their house in Luoan Village, which was a very small community in rural China. Luoan Village was known for being this beautiful, historic place, and as Qingmao and his family walked along, they passed by these beautiful, lush fields and saw these tall mountains off in the distance. But they also passed by something that made Qingmao and his family all very sad. The charred remains of dozens of burned out buildings were just littering the landscape. So Qingmao had lived in this village his whole life, and he remembered when it really was this happy, tight-knit community of over 100 people, and it really was just this picturesque place to live. But 3 years ago, that had all changed, and life in this village really became one disaster after another. There had been not one, but two enormous fires, which were caused by faulty wiring, but they had destroyed all these homes and businesses and all these historic buildings. I mean, it really kind of like changed the entire face of this town, and they still hadn't rebuilt it yet. But as bad as those fires were, it was actually what happened after the fires stopped burning that really, really made this place a nightmare on Earth. And it was that, for whatever reason, the mortality rate in this little village in China just spiked like mad. It was like all these people were just dropping dead out of nowhere. And it got to the point where the villagers were scared that like some illness was plaguing them, some unseen plague they didn't even know. And it got so bad, so many people were dying, that they brought in the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. They came in and actually did a full-blown investigation of this village. And they concluded that there is no connection between all these deaths. All these people that are dying in your village are dying from common illnesses or old age. Like, these are natural deaths. It's just this sort of anomalous spike in the mortality rate, and it's unfortunately, following this horrible tragedy, which were these fires. So it's basically like a tragic set of coincidences that these terrible things are befalling the village all at the same time. But a lot of people, including Qingmao, didn't buy that what was happening was natural. Instead, a lot of people began to think that their village was cursed. And so Qingmao and his family, they walked past all these burned out buildings, and they made their way towards the center of the village where there was a temple, because there was going to be yet another funeral for another person in their village, a young woman who had died inexplicably, at least in the eyes of the villagers. It didn't make sense she had died, but apparently it's a natural cause according to the CDC, but they were going to another funeral. And so into the temple they went, and before long the procession began. Later that night, Qingmao stumbled his way through the dark streets of the village towards his home. Following that funeral, Qingmao and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for this big ceremonial dinner that was typical after these funerals. And Qingmao's family, they had basically left pretty much right after the meal itself. But Qingmao, he was feeling kind of down, like many people in the village, considering their sort of cursed status as they believed. He had stayed behind, and he had continued eating and drinking some alcohol and talking with his neighbors. Now he was finally on his way back home. But as he walked, he suddenly felt this really sharp pain in his gut, and it hurt so bad that it was making it really hard to walk. And so Qingmao clutched his stomach and really had to force himself to keep moving one foot in front of the other. And then finally, when he got to his home, he opened up the front door, but the pain was so blinding that he just screamed out for help and then collapsed onto the ground right inside the house. And then Qingmao, as he's laying on the ground, he began vomiting uncontrollably onto the floor. And then he just passed away right there, right in front of his whole family. Now, Qingmao himself was not like a hugely influential person in this village. He'd been there his whole life, and everybody knew him, of course. But there was just something about his death that felt really monumental. It was like everybody in the village felt it, that when he died, for no apparent reason really, it just felt like enough is enough. There is no way these deaths that have ravaged our village are natural. It's not possible, and we will not take that as an answer any longer. And so the village director, who basically is like the mayor of the village, he wound up getting in touch with the provincial health department, and he told them what was going on and what the CDC had already communicated to them and how they didn't buy it. And so this health department, they sent out 20 experts to this village, and they did this big investigation to try to figure out, like, is there something causing all these deaths? Is it linked to the fires in some way? Like, what's going on in this village? And you know what they came up with? Well, turns out it's all natural. There's nothing wrong here. We believe what the CDC said. There's basically no issues whatsoever. You have nothing to worry about. And the village said, no. We still don't believe that. This is not acceptable. And so they went back to their village director and they said, you got to do something else because this is not acceptable. And he agreed. And so he actually got in touch with the police, just the local police, and said, hey, you come in, you investigate this. Try to see if there's something, anything that they have missed that could maybe explain why so many people are dying in this village. And so the police, they come into this village and they do this broad strokes, very wide sweeping investigation, and they do find something. And what they discover completely explains what's going on in this village. It would turn out the village's doctor, their one doctor, was this guy named Ma Foman. And Ma was not really a doctor. He had basically read a couple of medical books. That was the extent of his training. He was not a doctor. And so he's the guy they're going to whenever they have any medical issues, and he has no idea what he's doing. But he benefited from people getting sick because he's the town doctor. And so you have this guy who can't help you, pretending to help you, likely making it worse, who profits from illness in this village. So that's bad. But it gets worse. Ma was also the owner of the funeral home in this village, the one funeral home. So if his croc science, his croc medicine didn't save you, or if you didn't inexplicably get better basically on your own and you died, he also profited on you. So basically, Ma Foman had a monopoly on suffering in this village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money is if you lived. And for a while, Ma Foman just kind of allowed this setup to run as is. He didn't influence it at all. He just was a fake doctor and was the funeral director. But in time, he wanted more money, and so he began poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide, because then you have more people getting sick, makes more money, and more people dying, makes more money. But even that still wasn't enough for Ma Foman. He needed more death and suffering. And so those fires, that was not faulty wiring. That was just luck on Ma Foman's part that he wasn't caught. That was pure arson. He burned that place down, killing people in the process. Because again, he's got this monopoly on death and suffering in this village. And so in the end, the police who came in, they did this investigation and they discovered that those fires were actually arson, and it eventually led back to Ma Foman. In total, Ma Foman killed 76 people. All people that he lived with. These are like his friends and his family. These are his people. He killed 76 of them. And so he was ultimately convicted of murder and he was sentenced to death. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh sat at a dining room table inside of his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father to visit his aunt, whose name was Miss Blackwood, and also to visit his 19-year-old cousin, whose name was Madeline. Madeline was being looked after by Miss Blackwood because her parents had died 4 years ago, making her an orphan, and Miss Blackwood certainly had the means. She was very wealthy, and so she took Madeline in. And so basically that was her new de facto mother. And so Paul, his parents, and Madeline, they were all having this big, luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared for them, and they were waiting for Paul's aunt to wake up and come downstairs and join them. And this was not just like a formality because it was her house and they were, trying to be respectful. No, actually, they loved Miss Blackwood. I mean, Paul's aunt was awesome. She was super energetic and she was really fun. And of course, she was like very wealthy and her house was awesome. And so family generally loved to visit with Miss Blackwood. And so basically everybody's waiting for her to get up to start the day for real. But after a while, when Miss Blackwood had not come downstairs, the group just began eating their breakfast and just figured, maybe she's taking her time and we'll catch up with her, after breakfast or something. So everyone's eating their food and just chatting and having a nice morning, when suddenly the housemaid, who had stepped away a few minutes earlier, she comes running into the kitchen. She's very upset and she just yells out that Miss Blackwood is dead. And for a second, Paul was totally confused because just the night before, his aunt had seemed completely normal and healthy. There were no signs that she had any health issues whatsoever. But the family followed the housemaid up to Miss Blackwood's bedroom, and they went inside, and sure enough, there was Paul's aunt laying in bed, cold to the touch. She was definitely dead. Later that morning, Paul and his very distraught family met with Miss Blackwood's regular doctor in the living room of her house. The doctor had just finished examining her body, and he said that, Miss Blackwood really didn't have any clear signs of illness or injury. But he said, she's 70 and she had suffered from heart disease for the last few years, and so very likely heart disease is what ultimately killed her. Now, for the most part, the family all reacted with a mix of obviously sadness, but also like, okay, that logically makes sense. And Paul himself, he felt the same way. He's like, that's really awful. I can't believe she's gone. It makes sense, but he also had this weird feeling that he couldn't quite describe, that just, he felt like something's off here. He couldn't articulate it, but he just immediately had this sense that that could not be the story, that something else happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything to his family. He felt like it was kind of inappropriate to immediately start, suggesting conspiracies about what could have happened to their aunt when, again, logically, it did make sense what the doctor was saying. And so Paul just kind of kept it to himself. But he didn't stop thinking about it. Once the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all just stay in Miss Blackwood's house. They had a funeral to plan, they had to deal with her will and her estate. I mean, there was all these things that were left to do. And the family had already decided they were gonna come here and stay for a bit for a visit, so they'd already booked off this time. So the decision was they would just stay and try to sort of help get through this transition process. Fast forward 5 weeks. And Paul and his family are still staying in Miss Blackwood's house, largely because it was proving to be very difficult to sort of manage her estate. She was quite wealthy and going through her will and everything. It was just a huge mess. And so they were still there and they were still trying to figure things out. And by this point, Paul really didn't have a big role in any of that. He was just kind of there really to support his parents as they dealt with the estate. But Paul had kind of taken up his own mission secretly. He hadn't told people about his suspicions that something else must have killed his aunt. He didn't want to tell people that. He felt like he was kind of crazy for thinking it because he had no reason to think it other than a gut feeling. But he had begun sort of investigating. And his investigation had led him to begin sleeping in his aunt's bedroom because he had this belief that maybe his aunt's ghost would visit him in her bedroom and she would tell him or signal to him in some way what really happened to her. Now, for the past several days and weeks that he'd been in here, he had not seen his aunt's ghost, but he was not about to give up, at least not yet. So, on this particular night, this is again 5 weeks after his aunt has passed away, Paul is in his aunt's bedroom, he's in her bed, and he's laying there and he's getting ready to fall to sleep. As he's laying there, he begins to hear a strange sound over to the side of the room. It sounded almost like scratching noises. And the room is very dark. It's late at night. There's a window, but there's not much light coming in from the moon. It's just kind of dark in this room. And he opens his eyes and he rolls over and he looks over in the direction of this scratching sound. And he can't see anything at first. But then, as his eyes kind of adjust to the darkness, he realizes he sees something that he can't believe. I mean, even though in some ways he was hoping to see this, but he sees a hand, like a disembodied hand, actually a whole arm, is basically reaching out of the wall in his direction. And for Paul, he's obviously never seen anything like this before, and he should be terrified. I mean, he's basically seeing a ghost, but he's not scared. He's thinking, this is it, my plan is working. My aunt is signaling to me. She's gonna tell me in some way, shape, or form here what really happened to her. It's finally happening. And so with really no fear, Paul gets out of his bed, walks over to the disembodied arm reaching out of the wall, and he grabs it. After Paul grabbed the ghost arm, screams filled the whole house, woke everybody up, and Paul's father came running down the hall. He burst into the aunt's bedroom and he sees his son, and he sees what his son is grabbing. And he really can't even begin to process it. It would turn out there really was an arm reaching through the wall. But it wasn't a ghost arm. It was not, Miss Blackwood's ghost coming back to tell Paul about what happened to her. But this arm did absolutely have something to do with what killed Miss Blackwood, because she did not die of heart disease. When Miss Blackwood was still alive, the person who lived in the room next to her, where they slept, they drilled a hole in the wall big enough for their arm to fit through, and they reached through that hole at night while Miss Blackwood was asleep, and they poured poison into the water she kept by her bedside. They poisoned her to death. And then after she died from being poisoned, it was determined that she had died from cardiac arrest, and pretty much everybody accepted that, except for Paul. The killer was aware, even though Paul was keeping it to himself, that he was on to something. He was sleeping in Miss Blackwood's bedroom. It seemed like he was trying to figure out if there was more to the story than what everybody else seemed to believe, which was heart disease. And when it seemed to the killer like Paul really was getting close to figuring something out, the killer waited for Paul to be in the same bed, and he had a water next to his bed as well. The killer reached through and tried to do the same thing to Paul that they had done to Miss Blackwood. They tried to pour poison into his drink to kill him. But Paul was looking for a ghost in the room. He heard the sound of the arm coming through, and he grabbed the arm thinking it's his aunt's arm, but he really actually was stopping the arm from putting poison in his drink, and the screams were the sound of the killer realizing they've been caught. And the killer was none other than Paul's own cousin, the 19-year-old Madeline. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood took her in like her own child. And because she adopted Madeline, she put Madeline on her will. She was going to inherit Miss Blackwood's wealth. And Madeline just couldn't stand waiting for Miss Blackwood to die in order to get that wealth. And so she decided she would kill her. After Madeline was caught, she quickly confessed to Paul and his parents that yes, she had done it. And so Paul and his parents sent for the police to come out here and arrest Madeline for murder and also attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could even get there, Madeline suddenly began bleeding heavily from her mouth, and then she collapsed and died. It's not clear what actually killed her, but it's entirely possible, if not likely, that she actually used the same poison she had used to kill her aunt on herself to avoid facing justice.